Good news from Formula One testing. The Williams is finally here and we've seen it on track. It's not done that much so far, and as we speak we've seen it trundle around a little bit, if we're being honest, but it's great to see it finally on track with George Russell at the wheel, and just to see the team making some progress and showing the car in the flesh, the 2019 car that is. We've had the display car in the garage that's been confusing a few people. And I've got Scott Mitchell and Jake Boxall-Legge here with me to discuss what we're hearing from the team and what we've seen of the car as well so far. So Scott, let's come to you. We had Claire Williams talking to the media this afternoon. You were there. What's the mood like inside the team? You know, is it triumphant that we're finally on track, or another word that I think she might have said?
It definitely isn't triumphant. There is even the mammoth effort of getting a car ready in about 10 hours from arriving at the track at 4 a.m. today, on track this afternoon. Might be a triumph in itself, but in the context of missing 2.5 days of testing, certainly not triumphant. Relief is the feeling in the team. Claire said it was palpable. I could see it. I was down at the garage when the car got rolled out. It didn't come out the garage on its own. It got rolled out to start up in the pit lane, and every crew member in the garage surrounded the car. Everyone was stood around watching its first laps. So I think relief that they're finally on track, but unfortunately, obviously, this is just the start. They've given themselves a mountain to climb now.
Have they given us any more sort of background on how we got to this stage, or how they got to this stage? Is anyone going to have to carry the cam for this? What kind of explanation have we had beyond the fact that we're just running late, lads?
Very little.
And lasses.
Very little in the way of explanation, because Williams, as Claire put it, don't want to wear their dirty laundry in public. But what we do know is that car parts were late. They didn't have everything they needed, and they could only complete the build of the car, or what they needed to do, at the factory yesterday. That's why it got flown out late. But beyond that, they're not really saying. They're not saying whether it was in-house. They're not saying it was because of a problem with suppliers. Our understanding before was that it was linked to a problem in the scheduling that led to suppliers not getting what they needed in time, and therefore everything being a bit delayed in terms of things finally coming back to the car. So not ideal. It's going to be interesting now to see sort of what the outcome is. Claire says that the inquest into what's gone wrong isn't finished yet, which I'm a little bit surprised by, because if they say that they didn't find out until the end of last week that all this was going to happen, which strikes me as quite late in the day, if what we've heard and been told we have to believe is true.
The lead times on F1 cars tend to be a bit longer than that, don't they?
Exactly. So either they genuinely just hadn't clocked the mistake, and therefore it came and bit them in the backside very, very late in the day, or maybe there's not necessarily 100% honesty in terms of who's responsible, what's happened, and where the blame ultimately lies.
Now, there's been some quotes coming out from Williams using words such as embarrassment and talking about whether or not certain parts of the team perhaps are fit for purpose. Was there a sort of vibe of this is a team that's hit rock bottom today?
Yeah, I think so. I think the rock bottom pretty much came sort of earlier in the week, really. That was one of the things that sort of didn't quite understand, why they didn't just effectively in public write off the first test altogether. And then if this afternoon happens and they get out and they do a few laps and then they have a full day tomorrow, it's a massive victory. But they chose to be fairly honest, so we want to try and get there for Monday, it's not happened. We want to try and get there for Tuesday, it's not happened. So I think the way Claire put it was that now that they've got the car on track, that recovery of the team, because obviously they fell to last in the championship last year, is sort of back on track now, because they can start working through some stuff. But I think it's a bit generous to say things are back on track. Like I said, they've given themselves a mountain to climb now. Everyone else is in hundreds and hundreds of laps now of running. Williams, I think, had 5 or 6 by the time we left the media centre to come and do this video. So there is a lot of work to do, and Claire's right. The eye now needs to be on 2020 even. Make sure everything, as she put it, is fit for purpose, because otherwise all the work they do this year is going to be for nothing if they find themselves in the same place in 12 months' time.
Yeah, it's been really sad up to now. A great historic team like Williams, so many victories and championships behind it, and what we've seen this afternoon with poor George Russell, a real talent who's got a potentially very bright future. He's basically just trying to stay out of everybody's way while they're effectively trying to shake the car down, which is a bit sad. But let's come on to the car. Jake Boxall-Legge's here. We've had some really in-depth technical talks when cars have come out, but we're adding you into this one, and I think in some ways have we done you a favour, because you kind of gave the impression there's not that much to talk about on the Williams at this stage.
No, it's very underdeveloped, it's undercooked, as one of my colleagues would say. So there's some interesting parts to talk about, certainly, but you look at the front wing and you think, okay, that's very early spec, maybe even launch spec. They need to do some work on that, certainly because, well, it just doesn't look like a particularly optimised package. There are so many intricacies that other teams have found that Williams have come out of the box without having them. There is an interesting feature in that it's very aggressively using the flap adjuster for outwash, but apart from that, you probably would expect to see a few different specifications, and everything that's I wouldn't say in other areas that it's particularly underdeveloped as such, but everything looks very, very deliberate and heavy-handed almost. So you look at the bargeboard area, and there's a massive just slats, all trying to pick up and scavenge tyre wake and divert it down the car, and it's not done in a particularly gracious or graceful way. There's some refining to do, certainly.
And what about some of the areas further back on the car? We've talked constantly during this pre-season about teams getting ever tighter with their packaging and the complexity we're now seeing in the rear wing designs. Where do Williams stack up there?
Well, packaging-wise, towards the rear, it's quite promising, almost. There's a definite sort of Coke bottle shape that ensures that airflow is just sucked further down the car. But at the point of the inlets, it's very, very wide and very, very bulky. It almost looks like what Mercedes ran last year with their side pods, but again, less refined, a little bit larger. There's an interesting point sort of down the middle of the side pods where it sort of changes from undercut to just tight packaging, and perhaps they're trying to sort of channel some kind of airflow over the top and onto the floor and develop some kind of pressure differential around where the diffuser begins. But that is speculation, I appreciate. And then at the rear wing, that's another area that really needs a little bit of development. It just seems like a very, very basic, this is a rear wing. It's functional, it works perfectly, I'm sure, but there's so much to do at the rear of the car, especially in that area.
There's a lot of ground there to make up then, Scott. From what we've heard from the team so far, is there any indication that there's some sort of massive aggressive development push coming over the horizon, or are Williams nowhere near the stage where they can even start thinking or talking like that?
Well, the problem they've got now is that they've lost 2.5 days to work through the various bits they need to work through to make sure the basic package is okay. So if what Jake's saying is correct, and this is something for them to build on, but there's going to need to be quite a lot of building. They now need to spend this afternoon and the final day of the first test just making sure everything's okay in the beginning, and only when they've established that what they've got at the moment is reliable and they know where it stands can they then think about bringing and trialling new parts. So this puts them behind schedule, no doubt, to the tune of 2.5 days, which is problematic, and the team's not going to be drawn, and certainly hasn't been drawn so far, on where they are basically technologically. They're not saying whether they've made a step, they're not saying whether they've regressed, because they simply don't know, whereas all of their rivals now have 2.5, almost 3 days of data to work out where they are relative to expectations.
And lastly, Jake, would it be naive to perhaps suggest that all Williams have got to do is put an upgrade package on this thing and then we've got a proper 2019 F1 car?
There's still so much for them to do. As Scott says, they've lost 2.5 days, and even then, Monday morning, teams were coming out of the box with cars that they've shaken down already, cars that they've done initial systems checks on and they know it work. Williams haven't done that. They've had to cancel shakedowns. They've turned up 2.5 days late, sent George Russell out on a couple of runs. But
we're effectively witnessing their shakedown, aren't we? Which is unfortunate.
Exactly. And there's so much for them to do, and they can't even aero test here because they're missing parts. It's basically just making sure that everything works, everything is perfectly functional, but the real work is going to come next week, and they've got so much to do. There's a massive backlog on their schedule, I'm sure. So, they've got a lot to do and not very much time to do it.